The morning Eliza Easton spoke to the soil for the first time, the sky above the Colorado Territory was the color of a wound healing deep violet at its edges, bleeding into gold at the horizon, and the whole wide world was holding its breath like it knew something she did not. She had walked out barefoot across the frost-stiffened grass before the sun had fully crested the ridge to the east, her dark hair loose and tangled from another sleepless night, her husband's old work coat hanging from her shoulders like the memory of a man she was still learning to live without. The field stretched before her, 40 acres of it, ground that Thomas had broken with his own 2 hands 6 years ago when they had come out from Missouri with nothing but a wagon, 2 mules, and the kind of stubborn hope that only the young and the reckless carry so easily. Now the field was hers alone. Thomas had been in the ground since October, and it was April of 1874, and the planting season would not wait for grief. She knelt at the edge of the field where the soil had begun to thaw at its surface, and she pressed both palms flat against the earth, feeling its cold seep into the lines of her hands, and she said, quietly and without embarrassment because there was no one to hear her, "I don't know what I'm doing out here, but I'm here. I'm still here, and I need you to work with me this year because I cannot do it alone." She was not a woman who talked to herself as a rule. She was not superstitious, and she did not believe in signs. She was practical in the way that frontier life made a person practical. She could dress a wound and judge a horse's temperament, and calculate the seed-to-yield ratio of winter wheat with the kind of accuracy that would have impressed men who had underestimated her every year since she arrived in Colorado at 22. She was 28 now. She had buried a husband. She had a daughter named Clara who was 4 years old and slept in the back room of the sod house with a rag doll tucked under one arm, and everything that Eliza Easton did from this point forward, she did for that child. But she spoke to the soil that morning. She could not say exactly why. Perhaps because the loneliness had reached a depth that required some form of conversation, even if the listener was the earth itself. Perhaps because Thomas had loved this field so purely and completely that she felt, in some wordless and unscientific way, that he was closer to her here than he was at the church cemetery 3 miles east. She spoke to it again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "I planted the seed with him that first spring. I remember the way he showed me how deep. Not too shallow or the birds take it, not too deep or it can't find the light." She paused, her hands still pressed to the ground. "I remember all of it, so I'll do it right. I just need you to do your part." She did not hear the rider on the ridge above her. She did not know she was being watched. Lewis Lawson had come up from New Mexico Territory 2 weeks prior, trailing a small herd of cattle for a rancher in Pueblo who had hired him at the end of a long winter's worth of drifting. He was 31 years old, lean through the jaw and broad through the shoulder in the way of men who had spent their 20s doing the kind of labor that does not allow for any softness. He had a horse named Calico, a bay and white paint that he'd won in a card game in Las Cruces the previous autumn, and had come to love with the uncomplicated devotion he found easiest to give. He had a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, a good Colt revolver, and a reputation as one of the better trail hands in the Southern Territories, steady-tempered, reliable with cattle, and troublesome to no one who kept clear of starting trouble with him first. He had not intended to stop on the ridge above the Easton homestead. He had intended to skirt the low hills south of the property, keep his 20 head of cattle on the grass that edged the creek, and be in Pueblo by Friday. But Calico had thrown a shoe on the rocky ground near the ridge line, and Lewis had dismounted at first light to assess the damage, and from that ridge he had looked down into the valley below and seen the woman. She was small against the vastness of the field. The light was barely light yet, more the suggestion of morning than morning itself, and she was kneeling at the field's edge with her hands in the dark soil and her dark hair catching the first threads of gold that the sun threw over the ridge. And she was talking. He could not hear her from that distance. The wind was coming up from the south, and it carried her words away before they could reach him. but he could see the shape of what she was doing, the earnestness of it, the way her whole body seemed to be listening as much as speaking, and something about the sight of her stopped him completely. He held Calico's bridle in one hand and watched, and he did not feel that he was intruding, though he recognized that he perhaps was. He felt instead that he was witnessing something true. He had been raised by a mother who talked to her garden. She had done it every morning of his childhood, in the back lot behind their house in Tennessee, pressing the seed into the rows and speaking softly to the beans and the corn and the tomatoes as if they were company she enjoyed. His father had thought it peculiar. Lewis had always thought it made a certain kind of sense. The earth was the oldest listener there was. It had been taking things in for longer than any man or woman had been alive to offer them. He watched the woman at the field's edge, and he believed not as a religious conviction, not as something he could have explained to another man at a campfire, but in the quiet and certain way that a person sometimes arrives at a truth that has no logical basis and yet refuses to be dismissed. He believed she was right to do it. He believed the soil could hear her. He stayed on the ridge until the sun had fully risen, and the woman had risen too, dusting the earth from her palms, pulling the old coat tighter around herself, and walked back toward the low sod house at the property's center. Then he led Calico off the ridge and down toward the creek to figure out what to do about the missing shoe and the cattle and the Friday deadline, and the fact that the nearest blacksmith capable of setting a new shoe was in the town of Harlan, which was 4 miles west of where he stood, and also 4 miles in the wrong direction for Pueblo. Harlan in 1874 was the kind of town that the Colorado Territory had been producing with considerable regularity for the past decade: a main street of baked dirt, a general store, a land office, a saloon that also served as the town's primary social institution, a small church with a bell that didn't ring because the rope had rotted the previous winter, and a handful of residences that ranged from modest to barely adequate. It had a blacksmith named Orville Marsh who was 60 years old, enormously broad through the chest, and who charged fair rates and did excellent work, and it had a sheriff named Carl Dutton who was competent in a quiet way and had the town's trust if not its warmth. Lewis arrived in Harlan mid-morning with Calico limping slightly on the rocky road, and the 20 head of cattle making their displeasure known in the way cattle always did through sustained and emphatic lowing. He arranged the cattle in the pen behind the livery, paid the livery boy 2 bits to keep them watered, and brought Calico to Orville's forge. "New shoe and a reset on the rear left," Orville said after a brief examination. "Come back this afternoon." Lewis thanked him and walked to the general store because he needed coffee, and because he had nothing else to do in a town he did not know and did not intend to stay in long. The general store was run by a woman named Agnes Whitfield, who was 50-something and who had the quality of knowing everything that happened in Harlan and a 40-mile radius around it, and who shared this knowledge freely and without malice, which Lewis thought was the best way to share information. Just passing through, she asked as she measured out his coffee. "Cattle for Pueblo," he said. "Horse through a shoe. Orville'll fix you right. You come down from the South Road." "I did. Past the Easton place?" She asked, and her voice carried something careful in it, the way a person speaks about a subject they're treating gently. "I camped near the ridge east of there," he said. "Didn't come through the property." Agnes set the coffee on the counter and looked at him. "That's Thomas Easton's widow out there," she said. "Eliza, she's been alone on that place since October. Bad way to spend a winter, alone with a young child and 40 acres that need tending come spring." She paused. "She's a proud woman, won't ask for help, but anyone with eyes can see she's going to need it." Lewis paid for the coffee and said nothing more about it, and Agnes did not press him, and he went back to the forge and sat on the fence rail and drank the coffee and thought about the woman at the field's edge, her hands in the dark soil. Talking to the earth like it was the most natural thing in the world. He thought about it more than he should have for a man who had a Friday deadline and 20 head of cattle and no particular reason to involve himself in anyone's troubles but his own. Eliza Easton spent the morning of that same day working through her seed stores in the barn, cataloging what she had, what she needed, calculating what she could afford. The arithmetic was not good. Thomas had left debts that she had not fully known about, nothing scandalous, just the ordinary kind that accumulated when a man was optimistic about the next harvest year after year, and the harvests were decent but never quite as good as the optimism had predicted. She had paid the most urgent ones through the winter by selling 2 of the 4 mules and most of Thomas's tools, and what remained was manageable, but barely. She needed seed for the 40 acres. She needed help with the planting because she could not do it alone. She had tried to reckon this out mathematically, and it simply was not possible for one person to break, plant, and tend 40 acres while also keeping a 4-year-old child alive and maintaining the sod house and managing the remaining livestock. She needed either to hire a hand, which required money she did not have, or to reduce the planting to what she could manage herself, which would not produce enough yield to survive the following winter. She had thought about this problem from every angle she could find through the long, dark months of winter, and she had arrived at no elegant solution. What she had arrived at was the stubborn conviction that she would find a way, that giving up on the homestead was not something Thomas would have done, and therefore was not something she would do either, and that the soil would cooperate if she asked it to. Clara found her in the barn around noon, having woken from her morning rest and come looking with the directness that 4-year-olds bring to everything. "Mama," Clara said, standing in the barn doorway with her rag doll hanging from one hand, "are we having the beans for lunch again?" "We are," Eliza said. "I don't like the beans." "I know it." "Papa liked the beans," Clara said, and the matter-of-factness with which she said it, the uncomplicated way she moved between the present and the past without the grief that her mother carried, made Eliza's chest tighten in the way it still did 20 times a day without warning. "He did," Eliza agreed. "He always said they were his favorite." "Were they really?" "Probably not, but he said it." Clara considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old philosopher. That was kind of him, she decided, and went back inside, and Eliza laughed, the first real laugh of the day, the kind that surprised her when it came, that felt like something breaking loose from a great tight knot inside her chest. She finished her inventory, made her list, and harnessed the 2 remaining mules to the wagon. She would drive into Harlan for supplies and for the seed she could afford, and she would figure out the rest when she had to figure it out. She did not expect to run into the stranger on the main street of Harlan, but that was the nature of a town with one main street. Everyone on it was visible to everyone else, and there was no graceful way to pass unnoticed. Lewis Lawson was standing outside the general store when the wagon came down the street, and he recognized her immediately, though he had only seen her from a distance and from above. He recognized the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness she carried, and the dark hair that was pinned up now against the wind. She was sitting on the wagon seat with a small girl beside her, and the small girl was pointing at things on the street with lively interest, while the woman navigated the mules with competent, economical movements. He should have gone back inside the store. He had no business with this woman. He had never been introduced to her, and she did not know he existed. But Agnes Whitfield appeared in the store doorway at that precise moment, with the timing of a woman who had arranged this particular coincidence with some deliberateness, and called out, "Eliza, come and see what came in on the supply wagon from Denver." Eliza pulled the mules to a stop and climbed down from the wagon, lifting Clara to the ground before coming around to the boardwalk, and Agnes stepped back to hold the door open and make introductions in the efficient manner of a woman who has decided something needs to happen and intends to make it happen. "Eliza Easton, this is Lewis Lawson. He's a trail hand come up from New Mexico, passing through on his way to Pueblo. Mr. Lawson, this is Eliza Easton, who has the homestead east of town." Lewis took off his hat. This was the closest he had been to her, and he could see now what the distance of the ridge had not allowed him to see, that she had gray eyes that were very direct and very clear, and that she was exhausted in the deep way of someone who had been exhausted for a long time and had stopped expecting to be otherwise, and that she was looking at him with the polite wariness that a woman alone on a frontier homestead applied to all strangers as a reasonable precaution. "Mrs. Easton," he said. "Mr. Lawson," she said, and then, because Clara was pulling on her hand, she looked down at her daughter. "Clara, this is Mr. Lawson. What do you say?" Clara studied Lewis with unvarnished 4-year-old appraisal. "Your horse is very big," she said. Lewis glanced at Calico, who was tied to the rail outside. "He is at that," he agreed. "But he doesn't mind small people. You can pet him if your mama says it's all right." Eliza looked at the horse and then at the man and made the rapid assessment she was in the habit of making. "Go ahead," she told Clara, and Clara released her hand and went to the paint horse with the fearlessness of a child who had grown up around animals and had never been given a reason to be afraid of them. "He'll stand still," Lewis said. "He's good with children." "You've been in Harlan long?" Eliza asked. "Since this morning, horse threw a shoe. Orville fix it. This afternoon," he said. "He's good, takes his time but does it right." She paused. "You said Pueblo. What's in Pueblo?" "A rancher who wants 20 head of cattle by Friday and who will pay me for delivering them." Eliza nodded, and they stood in the mild silence of two people who have just met and are deciding whether the acquaintance is worth pursuing further. Clara had both hands on Calico's nose now, and was speaking to the horse with the same earnest directness that Eliza had applied to the soil that morning, and the horse was receiving it with patient stillness. "She does that too," Lewis said, nodding at Clara. "Does what?" "Talks to animals like they're listening. My ma used to say that means a person has good sense." Eliza looked at him sidelong. It was a strange thing to say to a person he had just met, and she tried to find condescension in it and could not. "Your mother sounds like she was wise," she said carefully. "She was," he said. "She's gone now, few years back." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She had a good life and she knew it." Agnes reappeared in the doorway with the efficiency of a woman who has had her moment of introduction making and is now returning to her regular business. "The coffee from Denver is better than the last lot," she told Eliza. "Come look." Eliza went inside and Lewis stayed on the boardwalk with Clara and Calico, and it occurred to him, not for the first time that day, that he was very much in danger of not making it to Pueblo by Friday. He stayed in Harlan that night. Orville had reset the shoe and done it well, and Lewis had no good excuse to linger except that he found himself not wanting to leave, and he was old enough to know that when a man did not want to leave a place, he should at least ask himself why before he went. He lay in the room above the saloon that cost him 20 cents for the night, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Eliza Easton and the 40 acres that needed planting and the arithmetic of the situation, which was the same arithmetic Agnes Whitfield had already laid out for him in the general store, and which he had been turning over in his mind ever since. A widow with a young child and 40 acres and no hands and insufficient funds to hire anyone could not make the planting work alone. This was simply true. He had farmed enough in his life to know it, before the trail work, before the drift south, before he had become the kind of man who moved between places and left no particular mark anywhere. He had grown up on a farm in Tennessee, and he knew what 40 acres required in the planting season. It required more than one pair of hands. He could send a message to the rancher in Pueblo explaining the delay. He had done similar things before for reasons less compelling than this. The rancher would not be pleased, but he would accept it because Lewis had a reputation for reliability, and because the cattle would arrive healthy, which was more than could be said for some drivers. He was not in the habit of inserting himself into other people's difficulties. He was particularly careful about this with women who had recently been widowed, because he knew the vulnerability of grief, and he respected the line between helping and presuming. But he also knew that there was a woman with 40 acres and a daughter to feed and a planting season that would not accommodate sentiment about either grief or pride, and that knowing this and riding past it would be the kind of thing a man remembered badly for a long time. He was still working through this calculation when he fell asleep. In the morning, he went to the general store and asked Agnes Whitfield what the Easton place needed most urgently, and Agnes told him, plainly and without making a great deal of it, which he appreciated. Then he went to the livery, collected Calico and his cattle, and rode east out of Harlan toward the homestead, and he told himself the whole way that if Eliza Easton sent him away, he would go without argument, because that was her right and he would respect it. Eliza heard the cattle before she saw them, the low collective sound of 20 head of beef moving along the creek road, which was not the sound she had expected on a Tuesday morning in April, when she was attempting to mend a section of fence line that the winter had pushed over. She straightened from the fence and put her hand above her eyes against the morning sun, and watched Lewis Lawson come down off the creek road with his 20 cattle and his big paint horse, and she felt something complicated in her chest that she could not immediately name. He stopped at the fence line and dismounted and held Calico's bridle, and looked at her with the kind of straightforward steadiness that she had noticed the day before, the quality of a man who has decided something and is not apologizing for it, but is also not being aggressive about it, simply presenting himself to whatever the situation requires. "I sent word to the rancher in Pueblo," he said. "Told him I'd be a week late. He won't like it, but he'll accept it. I thought if you'll have the help I could work the planting. I can break the ground and seed it. I know wheat and corn and I know soil. I'll ask nothing for it but a place to set my bedroll and whatever you can spare from the kitchen." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "Because the season won't wait," he said, "and you can't do 40 acres alone." "I know I can't," she said, which cost her something to say because she was not accustomed to admitting limitations. "But I'm asking why you'd stay. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't. But Agnes Whitfield speaks well of you, and I've been around enough people to know when someone's trying to do right by something that matters, and you are." He paused and looked at the field over her shoulder, the dark 40 acres of it just beginning to lose its frost. "My mother farmed alone after my father died. She made it work because people helped her. I've thought about that a lot since." Something in his face when he spoke about his mother, the same plain quality of grief that she recognized because she wore it herself, convinced her more than the words did. She regarded him for another moment, and then she looked at the fence post she had been trying to mend, and then at the 40 acres beyond it. "The barn has a spare stall," she said. "Calico can go in there. Your cattle can use the east pasture, there's grass and the creek runs through it." She paused. "And I'll feed you proper. None of those arrangements are charity, they're payment." "Understood," he said, and she could see that he was relieved, though he kept it quiet, and that too she recognized as the manner of someone who had learned to keep their feelings at a respectful distance from their face in order to function. "There are rules," she said. "Tell me. You work the field and not the house. If I need something in the house, I'll do it myself. You don't make decisions about this property. You carry out the ones I make. And whatever happens or doesn't happen, this is my homestead and my land and my daughter, and nothing about that changes because I've accepted help." "Those are fair rules," Lewis said. "And Clara," she added. "She'll talk to you and she'll follow you around and she'll ask you questions until you want to ride straight to Pueblo just to have some quiet. If that's going to be a problem, you should say so now." He looked at the small girl who had appeared in the sod house doorway at the sound of the cattle, still holding the rag doll, surveying the situation with serious brown eyes. "It won't be a problem," he said, and so it began. The first 3 days were the hardest. Not between Lewis and Eliza, between Eliza and herself. The internal argument she conducted every morning about whether this had been the right decision, whether she was exposing herself and Clara to a man she did not know, whether her desperation had overridden her judgment. She watched him closely in those first days with the scrutiny she applied to everything that affected her household, looking for the flaw she expected to find. What she found instead was that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a capable man who worked without complaint and with considerable skill. He knew soil. That was the first thing she confirmed. The way he moved through the field, the way he read the ground, the decisions he made about where to start breaking and how deep to turn the soil, these were not the actions of a man pretending knowledge he didn't have. He had farmed before extensively, and he had not forgotten it. He also, she noticed, worked hard. He was up before she was each morning, which she discovered on the third day when she came out at first light to find the fence line that had been listing badly on the south end already repaired, the posts reset, and the wire stretched taut. She stood looking at it in the gray pre-dawn and felt something shift inside her, not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something less definable and therefore more disquieting. He came out of the barn a few minutes later and stopped when he saw her at the fence, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You didn't have to do the fence," she said finally. "That wasn't part of the agreement. The cattle would have been through it by noon," he said. "It needed doing." She looked at the fence for another moment and then back at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. And he nodded once and went to get his breakfast before the workday started. And she stood at the mended fence line and watched the sunrise come up over the ridge to the east, pink and gold and enormous. And she felt something very similar to hope, which was an emotion she had not entirely trusted since October. Clara took to Lewis Lawson with the immediate and total conviction that very young children sometimes develop about people. The conviction that precedes reasoning and cannot be argued with because it is not based on anything that reasoning can address. By the end of the first day, she was trailing him through the barn, asking the questions that Eliza had warned him about, questions about the cattle and the horse, and where he had come from, and whether New Mexico was far, and whether he had ever seen a bear, and what his favorite food was, and whether he could whistle louder than Papa had been able to whistle, because Papa had been the best whistler she had ever heard. Lewis answered all of these questions with the patient thoroughness they deserved. He told her that New Mexico was a long way south, past the mountains. He said he had seen bears and that the trick was to make a great deal of noise so they heard you coming and went elsewhere. He said his favorite food was his mother's biscuits with molasses, and he whistled for her, a long, clear note that went up at the end like a question. And Clara listened to it with her head tilted and her expression judicial, and then announced, with characteristic directness, that Papa had been better, but it was a good whistle for someone who wasn't Papa. Lewis said that was a fair assessment and went back to work, and Clara went back to watching him, and Eliza observed this from the doorway of the sod house and found herself smiling in a way that surprised her with its ease. She did not smile easily anymore. She had thought through the winter that she might not smile easily again for a very long time, that the smile had gone somewhere with Thomas, into the same cold ground, and that what remained in her was functional but not warm. But something about watching Clara talk to this man, who listened to her daughter the way you listen to something that mattered, not with the dismissive half-attention that adults often gave to children, made the smile come before she could guard against it. She went inside before he could see it, and told herself not to be foolish. The work of the planting took shape over the following week in the way that sustained physical labor always does, through a rhythm that established itself gradually, a sequence of tasks that structured the days and gave them clarity. Lewis broke the ground in the east section first, working the 2 mules in steady passes up and down the field, turning the winter-packed soil over, and Eliza came behind with the seeder, laying down the rows of winter wheat with the precision Thomas had taught her. They did not talk much while they worked. There was no need to, and the work itself was loud enough with the sound of the mules and the creak of the equipment and the wind coming in off the hills. But they talked in the evenings, after Clara had been put to bed, when Eliza would make coffee on the stove, and sometimes they would sit at the table or on the porch, depending on the weather, and the conversation came easily in the way that conversations do between people who are genuinely curious about each other. He told her about New Mexico, about the 2 years he had spent working cattle in the high desert country below Santa Fe, and about the rancher he had worked for there. a good man named Rafael Solano, who had built his operation from nothing over 30 years, and who had treated his hands with the fairness that not all ranchers in the territory managed. He told her about before New Mexico, about the years of drifting that had followed leaving Tennessee at 22, the trail work and the various cantons he'd passed through, the particular loneliness of a life conducted mostly on horseback between destinations that never quite turned into home. He asked about Thomas, and she appreciated that he asked, because most people did not. Most people treated Thomas like something that should not be spoken of in her presence for fear of upsetting her, and she found their silence on the subject more painful than any conversation would have been. She told Lewis about Thomas Easton, about the man he had been, stubborn and optimistic, and not always right but always genuine, who had believed in this land with a conviction that the land had not always rewarded, but that she had loved him for, who had been a good father to Clara in his brief time at it, who had died in October of a pneumonia that had started as a cough and had gone fast in the cold, dry air. "He sounds like he was a good man," Lewis said one evening, and she was surprised by how much she needed to hear it from someone outside the small circle of people who had known Thomas, and said the same thing with the rote quality of social obligation. Lewis said it plainly as a conclusion reached from evidence, and it landed differently. "He was," she said, "not perfect. He was too proud sometimes, and he took risks with the money that I would not have taken, but he was good where it mattered most." "That's about the best any of us can hope for," Lewis said. She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them throwing warm light across his face. She had stopped being wary of him somewhere around the fourth day, the wariness replaced by something that she was not yet willing to name, but that made the evenings something she found herself looking forward to in a way that the days had not given her much reason to look forward to things. "What about you?" she asked. "You've never married." He was quiet for a moment, looking into his coffee cup. "There was a woman in Tennessee," he said finally, "before I left. We were set to marry, and then my father died and I left instead of staying, and she married someone else the following year, which was the right thing for her to do, and I've never blamed her for it." He paused. "After that I never much stayed anywhere long enough for it to be a possibility." "Do you regret it, the staying?" "Some nights," he said honestly. "Other nights I think the drifting taught me things that staying wouldn't have." He looked up from the cup. "What I know is that I'm 31 years old and I've been sleeping in barns and bunkhouses for 9 years, and that is starting to feel like something I'd like to be done with." She said nothing to that, but she held it, and he knew she did, and neither of them pushed it further because it was too new and too fragile a thing to push. The second week brought rain, which was both good and not good for the seeds already in the ground, not good for the continued planting, which Lewis had to pause for 3 days while the field was too saturated to work. He used the time to repair the barn roof, which had a section that had weakened over the winter, and to build a proper gate for the east pasture that had been managed with a makeshift arrangement of rope and posts that was neither secure nor dignified. Eliza watched him work on the gate from the window, on the second rain day, while she mended Clara's dresses and thought about things she was not sure she should be thinking about. She was 28 years old and she had been a widow for 6 months, and she was aware, in the rigorous and honest way she applied to most things, that what she was feeling in the evenings over coffee with Lewis Lawson was not simple gratitude, and was not merely the comfort of company after a long winter of solitude. It was something that had its own particular warmth and its own particular danger, and she thought she should be more alarmed by it than she was. She had loved Thomas. She had been a faithful and committed wife, and she did not diminish that by acknowledging that she was, apparently, still a woman who could find a man compelling. What alarmed her less than it should have, she thought, was how quickly and how specifically she found this particular man compelling. This man she had known for 2 weeks, who was leaving for Pueblo as soon as the planting was done, and who had no particular reason to come back. She put down the mending and looked out the window at the rain. She picked up the mending again and did not think about it further, at least not until evening. On the fourth rain day, when the sky had cleared and the ground was beginning to settle back toward workable, a man came down the road to the Easton place on a black horse, a man named Garrett Hales, who farmed a section northeast of Harlan, and who Eliza had known by sight and reputation for 2 years without warming to either. He was 40 years old and prosperous in the way of a man who had been prosperous so long that he had lost the ability to speak to anyone who wasn't. He was also widowed, had been for 3 years, and he had come by the Easton place twice in the winter months with what he presented as neighborly concern, and what Eliza had experienced as something more calculated. He pulled up outside the sod house and called her name, and Eliza came to the door and looked at him with careful neutrality. "Morning, Eliza," he said, with a familiarity he affected that she did not reciprocate. "I heard you've got a hand working the place. Thought I'd come by and see how the planting's going." "It's going well," she said. "The rain set us back a few days." "Set us all back," he said, and then his eyes moved past her to where Lewis had come around from the side of the barn, having heard the horse. Hales looked at Lewis with the particular expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had not expected. "This your hand?" he said to Eliza as if Lewis were not standing close enough to hear. "Mr. Lewis Lawson," Eliza said. "Mr. Garrett Hales, who farms north of town." Lewis came forward and put his hand out, and Hales shook it with the reluctant quality of a man doing something he would rather not do. "Trail hand," he said. "Among other things," Lewis said. "What are you paying him?" Hales said, to Eliza, and the presumption of the question, the assumption that it was his business, made Lewis go very still in the way he went still when he was annoyed but had decided not to act on it. "I don't see that that's information I need to share," Eliza said pleasantly, which was worse than sharpness because there was nowhere to take it. Hales tried a different approach. He looked at Eliza with what he considered to be earnestness and said, "You know, Eliza, I've been thinking that a woman in your situation, alone out here, all this land to manage, there are arrangements that would make a great deal of practical sense. I have a functioning operation. Clara would have stability." "You wouldn't have to, Mr. Hales," Eliza said. "I appreciate that you've thought about my situation. I'm not interested in arrangements of any kind at this time. If you'd like to discuss the soil conditions south of the creek or the price of seed wheat at the Harlan store, I'm happy to have that conversation. Otherwise, I think we're finished." Hales sat on his horse and looked at her and then at Lewis, and he was a proud man and he did not like what he saw, and he said with the stiffness of wounded pride, "You'll find eventually that pride is poor company in a hard winter, Eliza." "Maybe so," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Hales." He rode away. Lewis waited until the sound of the horse had faded and then said, "He come around often." "Twice this winter," Eliza said, watching the road. "He's not a bad man. He's just a man who thinks a woman alone is a problem that needs solving by a man." She paused. "I find that a particular kind of exhausting." Lewis was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "you seem pretty well capable of solving your own problems." She looked at him, and what she saw on his face was not flattery. It was the same plain, assessing quality that he brought to everything, and the honesty of it made her warm in a way she had not been warm in a long time. "Go get the east section started," she told him. "The ground should be workable by afternoon." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was just a thread of something in it, a smile held carefully back, and she went inside and allowed herself a smile of her own that no one saw. The planting was completed on a Thursday in the 3rd week of April, 1874, and it was one of those late spring evenings where the light did something particular with the land, going gold and then deep amber, and the field looked the way a finished thing looks, settled and quiet and full of its own potential. Eliza walked the rows in the evening light and Lewis walked with her, both of them tired in the satisfied way of people who have completed a large and necessary task, and Clara ran ahead through the furrows with her arms out like a small and joyful bird. "Wheat's in the east section and the north," Lewis said, though she knew this, looking at the field. "The corn is where the drainage is best. You should see germination in 10 to 14 days if the temperature holds. I know, she said. You've explained the planting 3 times. Have I? You have. He was quiet. Nervous habit, he said, when he stopped. When you're what? He looked at the field for a moment and then at her. The amber light was on his face and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain. When I'm about to leave somewhere I don't want to leave, he finished. The words sat between them in the evening air and Eliza did not immediately respond to them, and the silence was the kind that is not empty but very full, and Clara's running laughter came back to them from down the field, and the western sky burned down toward purple. You should go to Pueblo, she said finally. You have cattle to deliver and a reputation that depends on doing what you said you'd do. I know. And when you've done that, she said, and she said it looking at the field, not at him, because it was easier that way. He was quiet again, and she counted the seconds without meaning to, and then he said, I don't know where I'm going after Pueblo. I haven't had a reason to decide in a long time. He paused. This is the first place I've been in 9 years where I could imagine. He stopped again, and she appreciated that he was not making easy declarations about things he couldn't know for certain, because easy declarations were what she trusted least. Say what you mean, she told him, because she was not a woman who had patience for things left only half said. He looked at her directly. I could imagine staying, he said, if there was something here that wanted me to. She held his gaze. The light was going fast now, and the field was going dark behind him, and Clara had come back to stand at Eliza's side, taking her mother's hand with the uncanny timing of children who sense the weight of a moment without knowing what it contains. Go to Pueblo, Eliza said. Come back when you're done, and we'll talk about what staying might mean. It was not everything she might have said. It was not even close to the full measure of what was moving in her chest at that moment. But it was honest and it was open, and it was more than she had expected to offer a man she had known for 3 weeks, and the way Lewis Lawson looked at her when she said it told her that he understood all of that, the said part and the unsaid, in the way of a man who had been listening carefully. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3, Pueblo and back. The field will still be here, she said. So will I. He left the following morning with his 20 cattle and calico and his bedroll and his Winchester, and Clara stood on the porch and waved until horse and cattle and man had disappeared around the curve of the creek road, and then she said, with the directness that never failed to knock Eliza off balance, He's coming back, Mama. He said he would, Eliza told her. I believe him, Clara said, and went inside to get her breakfast. Eliza stood on the porch for a while longer and looked at the empty road and the field beyond it, the rose just barely visible in the morning light. And she realized that she believed him too, and the believing felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. She was not idle in the 3 weeks he was gone. She was never idle. Idleness was not in her constitution, but she noticed the absence of his work in the mornings, the quiet where the sounds of the barn had been, and she noticed that Clara asked about him twice a day, until Eliza gently suggested that asking once a day was probably sufficient. She also, in those 3 weeks, allowed herself to think clearly about what she felt, which she had been avoiding with considerable discipline while he was present. She thought about it the way she thought about the field practically, with attention to what was real and what was only wishful. She had known him for 3 weeks. She did not know the full shape of who he was, the difficult parts as well as the capable ones, the places where he might fail her or disappoint her, the habits and histories and small interior cruelties that every person carries and that only proximity and time reveal. She did not know if what she felt was love or loneliness mistaken for love, which was a thing she was willing to consider honestly, because she thought it a better use of her mind than pretending the question did not exist. What she kept arriving at, when she was most honest with herself, was this. She felt, in his presence, like she could breathe at a depth she had not been breathing at since Thomas died. That was a real thing. She had not imagined it. Whether it meant what she thought it might mean or whether it was something simpler, relief, companionship, the comfort of not being alone, she could not fully say. But it was real. She decided to let it be real and see what it became when he returned. He came back on a Thursday, 22 days after he had left, arriving in the evening with calico and nothing else. The cattle delivered, the rancher paid, the obligation fulfilled. He came up the creek road in the long slant of late afternoon light, and she was at the fence line, checking the south section posts, and she heard the horse before she saw him and felt, with a clarity that settled the question she had been deliberating for 3 weeks, a rush of something that was not compatible with the explanation that what she felt was only companionship or relief. She was glad he was back. She was more glad than she had expected to be, and she knew what that meant. He pulled Calico to a stop at the fence and tipped his hat, and she noticed that he had shaved somewhere on the road back, and that he was looking at her with an attention that held some of the same constrained quality she had seen in his face on that last evening in the field. Planting held, he said. Came up in the north section first, she said, just barely showing in the east. Another 10 days for the full field. He looked at the field and then at her. The place looks good, he said. You repaired most of what needed repairing before you left, she said. I've been maintaining it. I know you have. He dismounted, and they stood at the fence line in the evening, and the quality of the silence was different now from what it had been before he left, charged in a way that felt both alarming and right, and neither of them filled it with words immediately, because neither of them wanted to waste it on something that wasn't what they actually meant to say. I thought about this place every day, he said finally. The whole way to Pueblo and the whole way back. I thought about it too, she said, because she was honest with herself, and so she was honest with him. About whether it made sense, about whether this, whatever this is something I should be careful about. Did you reach a conclusion? Several, she said. Most of them contradicted each other. He almost smiled. That seems about right, he said. I reached a few of my own. Tell me one, she said. I think I want to stay, he said. Not as a hand, not as someone working the place for room and board. I mean here, in Colorado, near Harlan. He paused. Near you, if you'll allow it. She looked at him steadily and said, That's a significant declaration for a man who's known me a month. I know it, he said. I'm not an easy woman, she said. I have opinions about nearly everything, and I voice them without much concern for whether they're welcome. I have a daughter who is my first consideration in everything. I have 40 acres that require constant labor and a debt that will take 2 or 3 good harvests to clear. I am not a comfortable situation. I know that too, he said. I came back anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was very low now, and the field behind him was deep green with the new growth, and the sky was going pink, and she thought of Thomas, which she did not try to avoid, and what she felt was not betrayal but something gentler. The sense that Thomas would have looked at this man and seen what she saw, which was a good man standing in the right place at the right time, trying to be honest. Thomas had believed in seizing the honest thing when it presented itself. He had believed in this land for the same reason. I'll allow it, she said, on a trial basis. What does that mean exactly? It means you stay and we see what kind of man you are in the full measure of it, not just in good weather and good spirits. And I'll be the same for you, the full measure, not just the version I prefer to present. If it's real, it'll hold. If it isn't, we'll know that too. That seems fair, he said. It's the only way I know how to do things, she told him. He held his hand out across the fence rail, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she shook it, and the warmth of his hand around hers was the warmth of something beginning, and she held it a beat longer than a handshake required before releasing it. Clara, who had been watching from the porch with the instinct for drama that 4-year-olds possess, said from across the yard, Mr. Lawson, did you bring anything from Pueblo? I might have a peppermint stick in my saddlebag, he called back. Clara came off the porch at speed. The summer that followed was the longest and finest of Eliza Easton's life since coming to the Colorado Territory, and she knew it while it was happening, which she thought was a rare gift, to be able to feel the quality of a time while you were in it rather than only in retrospect. The field came in strong. The wheat in the east section was dense and tall by July, the corn in the north standing higher than her head by August, and she walked the rows in the mornings and felt the satisfaction of the soil having answered her when she had asked it to cooperate. Lewis stayed. He rode into Harlan and found himself a small room above the hardware store, which was slightly less disreputable than the room above the saloon, and he made an arrangement with a local rancher named Hector Briggs to work part-time for pay while he was not working the Easton place, which kept him from feeling that he was a man without purpose while also keeping him close. He came by the homestead most days, sometimes with a specific task in mind and sometimes without, and the relationship between them developed in the slow, layered way that genuine things develop, through the accumulation of ordinary moments that would not have seemed significant individually, but that together built something solid. He knew, by the end of June, that he loved her. He knew it with the same quiet certainty with which he had known, on the ridge that April morning, that she was right to speak to the soil. It was not a dramatic knowing. It came in the course of watching her work, watching her with Clara, watching her face when she read a letter or made a decision or laughed at something. Clara said, the particular way her face moved when she was fully present in a moment, the way her whole person went into whatever she was doing, the way she never performed either her strength or her difficulty, but simply lived both with the same straightforward honesty. He told her on an evening in late July, when they were sitting on the porch after supper and Clara had gone to sleep, and the night was warm, and the stars were the way Colorado stars were in summer, extravagant and indifferent and impossibly bright. He told her simply, without building up to it or constructing it carefully, because he had decided that the most honest thing was also the most straightforward thing. I love you, he said. I don't expect you to say the same thing back. I know it's been months and not years, and I know you're still in the middle of something I can't fully understand from the outside. But I thought you should know because you told me to say what I mean, and that is what I mean. Eliza was quiet for a while. The night made its summer sounds around them, the insects and the creek, and the distant lowing of the cattle in the east pasture. She was looking at the stars, and her profile in the dim light of the lamp through the window was very still. I know, she said finally, and he waited. I have known for a while. She turned to look at him. And I love you too. I've been frightened of it. I'm less frightened than I was. What were you frightened of? That it would mean forgetting Thomas, she said. And then I understood that it doesn't. That he's in the ground I walk on every day, and in the field he broke, and in Clara's face, and in the things he taught me. And none of that goes away because I'm alive and because you're here. The two things aren't in opposition. She paused. I took a long time to understand that. You don't have to apologize for how long it took, he said. I'm not apologizing. I'm explaining. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time in the warm summer dark, not filling the silence because the silence was already full of everything that needed to be in it. He asked her to marry him in September, when the harvest was coming in, and the field looked like something out of the kind of dream that practical people occasionally allow themselves despite better judgment. He did not make a grand occasion of it. He came to the homestead on a Sunday morning and found her in the field, as she often was on Sunday mornings, walking the rows in the early light, and he walked out to meet her among the tall wheat, and he said, I want to marry you, if that's something you'd consider. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had been direct since the first morning he'd met her. I've been considering it since July, she said. And, yes, she said, yes, I'll marry you. He wanted to say many things, but what came out of him was a laugh, not from humor exactly, but from the kind of relief that finds laughter as its exit because there's no other available door. And she laughed too. And it was the sound of two people who have been through enough difficulty to appreciate the simple and absolute rightness of a good thing. They told Clara that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the girl between them, and they explained it with the honesty that Clara's disposition demanded. That Lewis loved them both and wanted to live with them, wanted to be a family in the formal sense, and that this did not mean that Papa was forgotten or replaced, but that it meant they were going to add something new to what they already were. Clara listened to all of this with the serious attention she brought to important matters, and then she said, "Does that mean Mr. Lawson will live here instead of above the hardware store?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Good," Clara said. "It's too far to walk when I want to ask him things." They married in October, in the Harlan church with the bell that still didn't ring because no one had gotten around to replacing the rope, with Agnes Whitfield in the front pew looking satisfied in a way that made it entirely clear that she considered the outcome a personal success, and with Clara standing beside her mother in a dress that Eliza had stayed up 2 nights to finish, holding the rag doll with one arm and Lewis's hand with the other. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Harlan every 6 weeks, a quiet man named Reverend Alderton, who had married perhaps 100 couples in the Colorado Territory over the past decade, and who performed the ceremony with the practiced warmth of someone who genuinely believed in the thing he was doing. Eliza and Lewis exchanged the words that had been exchanged for centuries, and that still, in the saying of them, meant something specific and unrepeatable to every pair of people who said them. And when the preacher said Lewis could kiss his bride, Lewis did so with the deliberateness of a man who intends to do a thing properly. Garrett Hales was not there, which Eliza considered a mercy. Hector Briggs came, and Orville the blacksmith, and a handful of other Harlan residents who had watched the whole spring and summer unfold with the interested benevolence of a small community that roots for its own. After the ceremony there was a meal in the church hall, roast beef and corn bread, and 2 pies that Agnes had made, which were better than anything else on the table. And there was fiddle music from a man named Pete Carver who played in the saloon on Friday nights, and who played the jigs fast and the slower songs slow. And Lewis danced with Eliza in the way of a man who is not a natural dancer, but is trying hard and winning on effort. And she laughed at his footwork, and he laughed at her laughing. And it was a good evening. They came home that night to the sod house under the biggest moon of the autumn, the harvest moon that turned the field silver, and the field was clear now, the wheat and corn in the barn, the ground resting. Eliza walked out to the field's edge in the moonlight because she could not quite help herself, and Lewis came to stand beside her. "Are you talking to it?" he asked. She looked at the dark, quiet field. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I don't have anything to ask it. Tonight it gave me everything I asked for." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the field's edge in the October moonlight, and looked at the land that she had asked to work with her, that she had asked in the cold pre-dawn of April to cooperate, and it had. In ways she had not expected and could not have mapped from that morning when she had knelt with her hands in the frost-stiffened soil and asked a thing that did not have ears to hear her. She thought it had heard her anyway. Lewis had not stopped believing, from the morning on the ridge when he first saw her, that she had been right to speak to the earth. He believed it even more now, standing in the October field beside the woman who was his wife, feeling the particular and irreducible quality of a life that has turned toward something true. The earth had its own kind of listening. The soil had received what she asked and had given back more than she knew to request. The winter was different from the last one. It was cold because Colorado winters were cold without exception, and there was snow in December that came deep and stayed for 2 weeks, and the cattle required constant tending, and the sod house required constant heating, and the days were short, and the work was not diminished by the season. But it was not lonely. It was not the kind of cold that went all the way through a person because there was no one to ward it off with. Lewis was there, and his presence changed the quality of the whole house, not because he was loud or expansive, but because he was present in the way of a person who intends to be present, who has chosen a place, and is in it entirely rather than on his way to somewhere else. Clara bloomed through that winter. She was 5 now, going on 6, and she was a child who required constant engagement, intellectual and physical and social. And Lewis Lawson had, it turned out, infinite patience for the intellectual variety, which was what Clara primarily needed. He taught her to play checkers, and she beat him by February, which neither of them believed was purely the result of his instructional failure. He taught her to read her letters, which Eliza had begun the previous winter, but which had gone fitfully due to the demands on Eliza's time. With Lewis's help and Eliza's direction, Clara had a firm grasp of her alphabet and could read simple words by the time the snow came, and by spring she was reading the almanac with the focused attention of someone who intended to put the information to use. In the spring of 1875, they expanded the planting. Lewis negotiated with the land office in Harlan to file on an additional 20 acres to the south, which cost money they had carefully saved through the previous year, and they broke the new ground together in April, as they had broken the old ground the year before with the mules and the iron plow, and the two of them moving through the field in the rhythm they had established. And that was theirs in the way that shared labor creates something particular between two people who do it willingly. Eliza discovered she was carrying their child in May, and she sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Lewis, not from uncertainty, but from the private pleasure of knowing something enormous before anyone else did. When she told him, on a Wednesday evening at the kitchen table while Clara slept, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hands in both of his. And his face did something she had never seen it do before, something open and unguarded and full of a kind of joy that he had clearly not prepared defenses against, because he had not anticipated needing them. "Is that something?" he started, and she said, "It's everything," and that was the end of that conversation and the beginning of a new and complicated happiness. She told Clara the following morning, because Clara had a right to know before anyone in Harlan did, and Clara received the information with the characteristic gravity and then said, "Is it going to be a brother or a sister?" "We don't know yet," Eliza said. "We won't until it comes." "I would prefer a brother," Clara announced. Mrs. Alderton's girls always pull hair. Lewis, behind his coffee cup, made a sound that was either a cough or a laugh, and Eliza gave him a look that made him choose cough. The pregnancy was healthy, if demanding. The harvest of 1875 was a significant operation, 60 acres now, and Eliza refused to step back from it entirely despite Lewis's careful suggestion that she might take on a slightly lighter portion of the work. She negotiated a middle position that she considered reasonable, and that Lewis considered alarming, but accepted because he had learned, over the course of their marriage, that Eliza Easton's judgment about her own capacity was generally accurate, and that arguing with it produced frustration on both sides without changing the outcome. They hired a young man named Samuel who was 17, the son of a family newly settled east of Harlan, strong and willing, and in need of the wages that Lewis was now able to offer because the 60-acre harvest, in a good year, produced enough to cover the debts and the seeds and the expenses and have something remaining. Samuel worked through the harvest with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet learned that labor is something to be paced, and Lewis taught him that without diminishing the enthusiasm, which Eliza thought was the mark of a man who knew how to teach. The baby came in December, in the sod house, delivered by a midwife from Harlan named Mrs. Pemberton, who had been delivering babies in the county for 20 years, and who moved through the process with the calm authority of someone who has seen nearly every variation a birth can produce, and is rarely surprised. It was a boy, a big, healthy, vocal boy who announced his arrival in the early hours of a December morning, with the kind of conviction that Lewis, standing outside the bedroom door through the longest hours of his life, recognized as something that had been building for some time and was finally ready to be heard. Mrs. Pemberton came to the door and said, "A son, Mr. Lawson. Your wife and boy are both well." And Lewis sat down on the bench by the door because his legs had made a unilateral decision about continuing to hold him up, and he put his face in his hands for a moment and took 3 deep breaths that were not entirely steady. He was allowed in after a few minutes, and Eliza was in the bed with the color of a person who has done an enormous amount of work and is not yet done being tired from it, and she held a small bundle that was making a sound between a squall and a hum, and she looked at Lewis when he came through the door with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something beyond exhaustion and beyond joy and partway to something that didn't have a name yet. "Come and see," she said. He came and looked at the baby and felt. He could not have described it accurately later, because language is insufficient for certain kinds of experience. He felt the full and sudden weight of his own life, what it had cost to get here, the years of moving and the years of looking for something without knowing what, and the morning on the ridge with the woman in the field below, and the soil that she had believed could hear her, and all of it, every step and every loss and every open road behind him, had led to this room, this woman, this child. "Hello," he said to the baby very quietly. "He needs a name," Eliza said. They had discussed names through the summer and fall, and had agreed on several that satisfied them both. The boy became Thomas Lewis Lawson Thomas, for the man who had loved this land first and loved it well, and who lived in it still in ways that could not be measured. Lewis because it was his father's name, and because they both thought it should pass forward. Clara, brought in to meet her brother the following morning, inspected him with the scientific rigor she brought to all new phenomena, and announced that he was smaller than she had expected, and that his face looked like a raisin. Lewis, who thought this was not inaccurate, managed a straight face. Eliza did not. "He'll be bigger," Eliza told her daughter. "I know," Clara said, already losing interest in the raisin comparison and returning to the more pressing matter of what was for breakfast, which was the kind of merciful adaptability that children alone possess. Thomas Lewis Lawson grew. He grew with the appetite and velocity of a child raised on good farm food and clean Colorado air, and he grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, which was a combination that kept everyone in the household on their toes in the most worthwhile possible way. By his 2nd year, he was following Lewis around the barn with the same purposeful devotion that Clara had displayed, except that where Clara's primary interest had been in asking questions, Thomas's primary interest was in doing things, and Lewis discovered that teaching a determined 2-year-old the correct technique for anything required more patience than he had previously understood himself to possess, and apparently did in fact possess. Eliza watched this with a private pleasure that never quite left her face when she thought no one was looking, and Lewis caught her at it one afternoon when she was standing at the kitchen window, observing him, and Thomas engaged in the serious business of filling the water trough. Thomas with a small bucket that Orville had made specially, doing his measured contribution to the enterprise, and when she realized he had seen her watching, she did not look away but smiled instead. The full smile that she had once held in reserve as if it were a finite resource, but that had become, over the course of their years together, less carefully rationed. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I like that look on you." "What look?" "The one that's not worried about anything," he said. "You've always been capable of it. You're better at it now." She considered this. "I'm not less worried," she said, because she was not going to be imprecise about it. "There's always something on the land that requires concern, but the worry is different now. It doesn't feel the same as it did." She paused. "Before, it was worry with nothing underneath it. Now the worry sits on top of something solid." He understood this completely. He had felt it himself, the difference between concern that falls into emptiness and concern that is contained by the ground of something real. The ground was the life they had built, the field and the house and the children, and the slow accumulation of days that had weight and color and texture, days that meant something because they were shared. The years moved in the way of good years, not quickly, because good years resist the rush, but with a fullness that made looking back feel like looking at a country with many distinct regions, each one different from the last but all of them connected by the same soil. In the spring of 1877, They added another section to the east and hired Samuel full-time, because the operation had grown to the point where part-time help was no longer sufficient, and Samuel had grown too, had learned the land and learned the cattle, and had become reliable in ways that Lewis valued precisely, because he had once been the young man in someone else's operation learning those same things. In the summer of that year, Clara, 7 years old and possessed of opinions about everything, decided that she wanted to learn to ride properly. Not the pony rides that Lewis had been giving her for 2 years, but real riding. And Lewis spent 6 Saturday mornings teaching her on a gentle mare called Nutmeg, while Eliza sat on the fence rail and observed, and tried not to give advice when it was not asked for, which she found one of the more demanding exercises of her marriage. Clara took to it the way she took to most things, with absolute commitment and a frustration rate that decreased steadily as the skill increased, and by the 6th Saturday she was cantering Nutmeg in circles around the yard with the focused calm of a natural rider, and Lewis came and stood by Eliza at the fence rail. "She's good," he said. "She is," Eliza agreed. "She gets the balance from you," he said. Eliza looked at him. "I don't ride." "Not on a horse," he said, "but the way you balance things." "She has that." He was quiet for a moment, watching Clara. "She has Thomas's persistence too, all the best parts of both of you." Eliza was quiet, watching her daughter ride, and then she said, "He would have been proud of her." "I know it," Lewis said. "Are you?" she asked, and the question held a weight that she had not fully articulated before, not in so direct a way, whether Lewis, in the full measure of the years, felt what a father felt, what the word meant in its practical application to a child he had not made but had chosen. He did not hesitate. "Every day," he said. "She's mine in every way that matters." Eliza reached across the fence rail and took his hand, and they stood there while Clara made her circles on the gentle mare, and the field beyond the pasture showed its green under the summer sky, and Thomas was in his corner of the house's life. Present the way the beloved dead remain present, as flavor and shape in the living, as the soil that the new growth rises from, as the fact of what was loved honestly and well. The debt cleared in the fall of 1878, the last of Thomas's obligations paid out to the final creditor, with the proceeds of a particularly strong harvest that had benefited from a summer of good rain and 2 seasons of Lewis's improvements to the drainage in the north section. Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the final receipt, and the certainty that the land was theirs, entirely, unencumbered, and felt a closing of something that had been open since October of 1873, like a wound that had finally, fully sealed. She told Lewis that evening, and he opened the bottle of whiskey he had been keeping for a specific occasion, and they each had a glass, and Clara had apple cider in deference to her 8-year-old status, and Thomas, for now, and enormously pleased to be included in anything that resembled a celebration, had his as well, and they sat at the table, and Lewis raised his glass. "To Thomas Easton," he said, "who broke the ground." Eliza looked at him across the table and felt, at that particular moment, the full and complete convergence of everything she had asked the soil to help her hold on to on that April morning when she had not known who was watching from the ridge. She raised her glass. "And to what grows from good ground," she said. They drank. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eliza went out to the field one last time that evening in the warm fall dark, and she knelt at the edge of the west section and pressed her palms flat against the ground the way she had done on that first morning. The soil was cooler now, the season turning, and it felt the same as it always felt, patient and deep, and older than anything she could imagine. "We made it," she said to it quietly. "You and me and Thomas and all of it, we made it." She was not sure even now that the soil could hear her. She was not sure it couldn't. What she knew was that the speaking of it mattered, that the acknowledgement of the thing she owed to this ground was necessary and true, and that she would be back in the spring, at sunrise, when the season turned again, to ask it once more to work with her. She rose from the ground and brushed her palms clean and turned back toward the house, where the lamp in the kitchen window burned steady and warm. Lewis was in there at the table, reading the almanac in preparation for the next spring's planting, because he was that kind of man, not the kind who rests once a thing is done, but the kind who looks toward the next thing with the steady orientation of a person who has found a direction worth facing. She went inside and sat down across from him, and he looked up from the almanac with the particular expression she had catalogued over these years, the one that meant he was glad she was there, that her presence in a room was something he noticed and valued every time and had not yet begun to take for granted, which she thought was the finest thing about him. "What did the field say?" he asked with the same plain sincerity he had once applied to the observation that Clara talked to animals like they were listening. "That it'll be a good year next year," she said. "I believe it," he said. She did too. She reached across the table and turned the almanac so she could read it, and they sat together in the warm kitchen of the house on the land that had heard her when she asked it to, and the night settled around them, and the field rested in the dark outside, and everything was whole. By the time the spring of 1880 arrived in the Colorado Territory, the Easton Lawson homestead, which was what people in Harlan had taken to calling it, with the easy informality of a community that has watched a thing develop over years and considers it its own collective success, had become one of the most productive operations in the county. 60 acres under cultivation, a small herd of quality cattle, a barn that Lewis had expanded twice, and a sod house that had been progressively improved until it was more properly described as a proper timber frame house with 4 rooms and a sleeping loft. Built over the winter of 1878 with help from Hector Briggs and Orville Marsh, and Samuel and a half-dozen other men from around Harlan, who came 2 Saturdays in November with their tools and their wives, and built it in the communal way of frontier communities, when one of their own needed something they couldn't do alone. Eliza had stood in the middle of the new house that first evening, when everyone had gone, and the children were in their new rooms making the particular sounds of children exploring new space, and she had looked at the walls and the beams and the solid floor, and she had thought, Thomas would have been pleased. Not with a bitterness in the thinking of it, but with the cleanness of a thought that could be true without requiring sorrow, because she had gotten to a place where Thomas's name in her mind produced warmth more often than it produced grief. Clara, at 10 years old, was a serious and vivid person who read everything she could get her hands on and who had developed, under Lewis's patient instruction and her mother's intellectual encouragement, a particular interest in plants, their varieties and behaviors, and the conditions under which they flourished, that Eliza thought was both lovely and entirely logical, given that the girl had grown up with her mother's hands always in the soil. She talked about the plants and the soil with the same interested directness she had once applied to everything else, and Lewis sometimes said she was going to be a scientist, which Clara received with the equanimity of someone who thinks this is obvious. Thomas, at 6, was a different creature, physical and immediate and interested in the horses above all other things, which Lewis found completely congenial, and which Eliza encouraged with the same philosophy she applied to everything about her children. That the point of raising a person was not to make them into a particular shape, but to give them enough ground to find their own. In the April of 1880, Eliza woke before sunrise on a Thursday morning and went out to the field in the pre-dawn dark, as she did every spring, and she knelt at the edge of the east section where the wheat would go, and she pressed her palms to the soil and felt the cold of it, the same cold she had felt 6 years ago on the first morning of this practice, and the soil received her hands with the same patience it always had. "One more time," she said. "Same as always. Work with me this year. We've got a good thing going, you and I." The sky to the east began to lighten, the deep violet bleeding toward gold, the same colors that had been there on that first morning, and she did not hear Lewis on the ridge behind her because he was not on a ridge. He was standing at the edge of the yard where the grass met the field, watching her the way he had watched her from the ridge in 1874, with the same belief he had carried then, grown deeper now by 6 years of proximity and knowledge. She rose and turned, and he was there, and she was not startled because she had come to know the quality of his presence the way you know the sound of a voice that has spoken to you every day for years, and she looked at him in the new light, and he looked at her. "You never stopped," he said, "every spring." "Why would I stop?" she said. "It works." "It does," he said. She walked to him through the cold grass, and he put his arm around her, and they turned together to look at the field, which was just beginning to show the bare possibility of the season. The soil dark and rich and ready, the sky going golden above the ridge line. The whole wide territory of the Colorado morning opening up before them the way it had opened 6 years ago when he had been a man with a lame horse and a deadline for Pueblo, and she had been a widow with 40 acres and a 4-year-old daughter, and a belief that the earth was listening. It had been listening. She had been right. And he had known it from the ridge, and he had come down from the ridge and across the field and into her life, and he had stayed, and the staying had made everything. "Another good year," she said. "Yes," he said. From the house, a 6-year-old's urgent voice. "Mama, Papa, Thomas took my rag doll and won't give it back." And Clara at 10, with the weary authority of a decade's seniority. "Thomas Lawson, give that back right now before I tell Papa you were in the barn without asking." Lewis and Eliza looked at each other in the morning light, and the laughter came easily, naturally, from a deep and happy place that the field had helped them find, that the soil had helped them build, that 6 years of honest and difficult and wonderful living had made into the most solid thing either of them had ever stood on. They went inside to their children and their breakfast and their life, and the field behind them absorbed the morning light and held everything that had been asked of it and given back, and the sky went wide and gold above the Colorado territory. And it was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily good morning.